on the other side. Everyone, thank you for joining us at the start of day 2 here. We'll give everyone just a second to kind of filter into the Zoom room here before we get started. And I also know some of you are joining us from the lobby, and this could be in terms of streaming this in terms of the lobby. So, also feel free to jump into the room. So I have the pleasure of moderating one of our parallel sessions this morning, which is funding digital mental health research, an expert-led discussion and Q&A on hot topics. And we have two amazing experts today. We have Adam Haim from the National Institute of Mental Health. And then we also have Andrew Barr, founding partner of GreyMatter. And I'll give them a little bit more introductions and also ask them to introduce themselves in a second. So just to sort of introduce this panel, I know a lot of you are interested in thinking about how we fund the different work that we're trying to do in digital mental health. How do we get our products out there? How do we get our research conducted? And how do we make sure we're able to conduct some of the evaluations and grow the evidence base that we've talked a lot about in this conference already? And again, we have two just like really leading experts to talk about this. It's just a little orientation to the panel. We will be doing Q&A. I will start with some questions. We'll also take questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, please put it into the Q&A, and I will be checking those throughout the session. So it's just a brief intro. So first we have Dr. Adam Haim. Dr. Haim is the Chief of Treatment and Prevention Intervention Research Branch and the Chief of Small Business Innovation Research and the Small Business Technology Transfer at the National Institute of Mental Health. Dr. Haim got his PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Albany and completed his clinical internship at the Baltimore VA Medical Center. He did a postdoctoral research fellowship at NIMH before going off and working somewhere else, and then returning to NIMH in 2006 as a program officer, and has continued to raise the ranks ever since then. So really happy to have Dr. Haim here on our panel. We're also joined by Andrew Barr. Andrew, as mentioned, is a founding partner of GreyMatter and a mental health-focused investor. He received a Bachelor of Science in Economics with a concentration in finance from the Wharton School and a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to GreyMatter, he advised and invested at the intersection of mental health technology, supporting a range of startups and nonprofits. He brings considerable expertise, including lived experience, to this work, and has been just like such a just a knowledge broker of funding and supporting work in digital mental health. So that's a little bit of their backgrounds. I'll start with a question for each of them. And so maybe Dr. Haim, if you can go first. Can you just provide a few minutes to provide some perspectives about how you think about funding digital mental health broadly and then also research specifically?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Great to be on this panel. Really looking forward to your questions. So at a high level, NIMH's mission is to treat and prevent mental illness, and we see digital mental health technology as a key component toward working toward this goal. And I really am looking forward to discussing NIMH's funding in this space more broadly during this session. But as a bit of background, NIMH is divided into primarily three funding divisions. So we have basic science, so at the molecular level, translational science, and then confirmatory efficacy, effectiveness, and services research. And that's kind of the space that I'm in, and much of the digital mental health research that we fund is in that space. And NIMH's budget is allocated across these three large buckets. So applicants submit applications to funding announcements. They then are reviewed and scored, and then meritorious applications are funded. So NIMH has standing funding announcements like our clinical trials funding announcements. We also have center announcements such as our Alacrity centers, as well as special initiatives focused on new areas of research And they span to accommodate all sorts of applicants, from academia to small business to industry. Just one little insider trick is that we discuss all of our funding announcements and concepts for new funding announcements at the open session of our advisory council meetings, which are open to the public, and it's a free glance into our key priority areas. So just quickly, the process for obtaining funding is to develop a concept, and we can talk more on that in a bit, and then reach out to the relevant NIMH program officer. And I can paste a link into how to find a program officer via matchmaker process. And I can't emphasize enough that it's really important to reach out to an NIH or NIMH program officer if you're interested in seeking funding. I can also talk a bit later about common pitfalls in the grants process, but specific to digital mental health research, just a bit of history. So NIMH has been in the digital health space for about 20 years, but up until around 2016, we didn't really have a unified plan about digital mental health research. So we pulled together a work group in 2017 with external stakeholders and identified key opportunities and challenges in digital mental health and published a white paper about that in 2018. And essentially, the bottom line is there are three priority areas. One really focused on utilizing digital health for assessment. The other thinking about intervention refinement and testing, so using digital health technologies to enhance the reach or boost of therapeutic interventions. And then the third bucket is service intervention and service delivery, so using technology and harnessing it to facilitate service delivery via patient-facing, clinician-facing, and systems-level interventions. So we put these recommendations into action, and again, we have a number of active funding announcements that I'd really be excited to talk about. And I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. Haim. Same question to you, Andrew. What are some of the perspectives or what that you bring to thinking about funding work in digital mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my lens in this is slightly different, right? Coming from the lens of venture capital. And so what we're looking at are generally, sits more in the world of things that are somewhat proven, have some kind of, even if limited, evidence behind them, and then figuring out how to really scale them up, right, in practice. And so I think that sometimes the more, it's called the more like validation side of something can be worth doing from our lens. I think there's also this level of, often when you think about, how does this fit inside of a company that actually scales, there's a lot of parts of like how it might look in the kind of pristine, let's like run the initial research, then let's figure out how it's actually going to work in the real world. Like actually trying to figure out like what is going to happen there is a critical part of the process when you start to have to think about, okay, what does, patient engagement look like, or what does distribution look like, or what does monetization look like? You start to have to ask some different questions and maybe even kind of tweak where you started initially. And I think that from our perspective, we're very focused on investing in things that will actually work for patients and and deliver value, and that's ultimately how we think people build long-term, valuable, important businesses that make an impact and scale these solutions. And so, from our perspective, some amount of research and clinical validation is usually a critical part of that. Most of the companies that we're funding have either what they're doing is based on some amount of research, right, already, and they've sort of maybe they've adapted it in some way, shape, or form, and or they're running their own sort of pilot studies and trials to prove that what they're doing actually works. And so I think it's a really, when we think about it from our lens, maybe we don't think of ourselves as a traditional research funders. Maybe it's a, in a certain sense, we're more of indirect research funders. But there's this whole ecosystem of venture capitalists like us who are out there trying to find early stage ideas that could really make a big difference and provide that catalytic early funding that will get them from that kind of concept level or sort of a semi-proven hypothesis to something that we really know can scale up and touch millions of people.
Awesome, great. There's actually something you mentioned, Andrew, that I'd love to follow up on and hear both of your opinions on. And you said, you're really focused on funding things that will really work for patients. And I also know NIMH is really interested in funding things that will move the needle and, improve people's lives. And so I'd be curious, each of your perspectives, maybe starting with you, Andrew, how do you think about, what helps you understand whether or not an idea will do that? Like what evidence is necessary, or what work do you expect people do to try to answer that question of how do we know this will work for patients?
Yeah, I mean, there's like anything, there's a lot of it depends in this, right? And there's kind of I think that we think about it on a few different axes, right? We think about sort of both how big the problem is and how much the solution as envisioned can move the needle. And that's, maybe you could call that kind of an effect size way of looking at things. You could also look at it from, I think when we think about, let's say, how underserved that population is, right? And we think about, okay, how do you think about comparing that to the status quo? I'll give an example, we're investors in a company that treats, adolescents who've experienced psychosis, right? Or are experiencing some very serious mental challenges. That's in many cases, such an underserved population that maybe we're willing to, we obviously would want to make sure that in a vulnerable population, there's a lot of evidence and there's clinical oversight in that. But, the kind of depth of the problem, the well and how underserved it is, probably lets us say, okay, that's a more exciting area to look at versus something that's very well served. So that's on one dimension, right? I think another area where we think about, how does this work and how do we think about the evidence generation and, what's needed and what we're evaluating, is around how scalable it is, right? So you've got on one hand, it's like how big is the impact, and then two is like how scalable it is. And that's going to, dive into questions around, how actually is this implemented? How is it distributed? How's it paid for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, when we're looking at a very early stage company, we're usually looking for, evidence or sort of some kind of proof points that give the founder confidence that this works. And so that can take a number of different forms. In some cases, we have, a company that works in the PTSD space that, it's based, their intervention is based on, kind of gold standard, heavily researched PTSD interventions that have already been proven in academia and then adapted for their model, right? In some really interesting ways. And that's like an area where we say, hey, look, like, companies led by a clinician in this case, it's pretty easy to get, or in our perspective, it's pretty easy to get comfortable that this is something that will at least not do harm and is very likely to work, right? I think there are other cases where, maybe with something that's maybe a little bit less intensive, we're willing to, and if we sort of see that there's at least some little glimmer of hope in the early days and something that, feels like we're confident that, again, that it will not do harm to patients, maybe we're willing to lean in a little more on that and say, okay, well, we don't know if this is proven. Maybe it's a game that will help kids with anxiety. I'm just making it up, as a hypothetical example. Maybe we're willing to say, let's give it a chance. Maybe there's not evidence today, but here's why we think it really could work, or here are the principles it's based on, and maybe it's a little bit less one-to-one. So for us, it's a little bit, it's kind of a bad answer in many ways, but it is subjective, and it has to do with kind of the, let's say, the risk reward involved, right? And if the reward is high enough, maybe we're willing to lean into a little bit less evidence and maybe fund a little bit more evidence generation, depending.
Awesome, great, thanks. Dr. Haim, how do you guys think about this at NIMH in terms of thinking about, again, what signals or what evidence or how you guys think about determining what will work for patients?
Yeah, so it's a nuanced question, and I think particularly within the context of the digital mental health landscape or digital health landscape. So we're a relatively small player in this field, and the field includes many digital health interventions that are making a lot of money but have very limited efficacy effectiveness signals. So we're trying to fund rigorous research across multiple areas of research to try to find out what works and for whom. So within the context of the larger landscape, there's a lot of stuff going on. We're a small piece, and how do we define our space in such a way that we can ensure that our research is informing what works for patients. So at the forefront, almost all of the research we fund requires looking at clinical outcomes and requires a focus on either the prevention or treatment of mental illness. So we're not as focused on looking at overall reduction, for example, in stress. We're really focused on mental illness, the prevention and treatment of mental illness. And the research questions that we want to answer really depend on the stage of the research, whether it's an efficacy question where you have a more tightly controlled patient population, or an effectiveness question, which is done in the wild. Another thing that we think about is, at the end of the day, So who's going to buy this and why are they going to buy this if in fact it works? And thinking about who those consumers are and what evidence they need. So if it's a large provider organization, do they need evidence of cost effectiveness? If that's the answer, then we want that baked into the research design. So when the research is done, those stakeholders say, okay, not only does it work at the patient level, but it's going to save us money. So that's also an important piece. And we design funding announcements that include that language. We also have a whole small business innovation research grant portfolio that is really focused on developing highly engaging, effective interventions that are proposed by small businesses who they themselves have the capacity to put things out into the wild and make sure that they're effectively working at the patient level.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And it makes me think I teach research methods for our graduate students here at the University of California. And I try to convince all of my students that there's no such thing as a good method. There's methods that match your questions. And I think it's a lesson that we can continue to remember as researchers or as founders as they think about how to develop evidence to support the digital mental health work that they want to get funded. So maybe shifting gears a little bit, what do you think is different about funding digital mental health now than, say, 5 years ago? What trends or differences do you see in terms of how you're approaching things? And 5 years is a little bit of an arbitrary number, but what do you see as different today? Maybe starting with Dr. Haim.
So that's a great question because it's evolved, right? Digital mental health has evolved to sort of a backwater, esoteric, okay, we're going to try this unique way of delivering an intervention, DVD-based intervention or computer-based, and it's evolved dramatically over the last 5 years. I would say the couple different ways that we're thinking about it differently is one, getting back to the point around like the larger landscape includes a number of significant players who have effective platforms with maybe not really strong evidence bases. And I think NIMH's position for a while was we're going to resist in our space. They're going to do their thing, and it's probably not going to be super effective. It may be, commercially viable, but we're not going to get involved in that space because we're really focused on developing the evidence, developing the efficacy and the effectiveness. And then there was this turning point of, wait a minute, they have really, really well-established platforms that have millions of users and maybe a limited evidence base. So why don't we think about partnering or having academic folks partner with those large existing digital health platforms and trying to embed research onto that platform, trying to make more engaging ways to embed interventions there. So I'd say that's one piece that has evolved over time is partnering with these large platforms to try to push our mutually beneficial agendas forward. I would say the other thing that has become more apparent is just because you build something that works and maybe gets regulatory approval doesn't mean that it's going to suddenly be available to everyone that wants it. So there's a large number of hurdles to getting something out there in the universe that can be reimbursed, that can be sustainable over time. And I think we're becoming more involved in that space, ensuring that there is the appropriate linkage to the regulatory bodies as part of the grants process to ensure at the end of the day there is a valid reimbursement process in place.
Great, thanks. Andrew, same question. How do you think, what do you see has been different about funding in digital mental health now than, say, 5-ish years ago?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, just picking up on a couple of threads that I love that Dr. Haim is focused on there. I mean, I think the reimbursement pieces, right, and the regulatory pieces are just so critical. And I'm really heartened that that's being focused, this is a key focus earlier in the funding cycle. Because I think one of my least favorite things is to get a really cool idea, something that like really seems to work, but there's really no path forward for it in the market. That's like the most disappointing kind of call to have. And so that's truly fantastic. I think those are a lot of the really right things here. When I step back and look, putting in perspective, 5 years ago was a time when, the average person you talk to would have told you that telehealth doesn't really work, right? Like, I mean, the world has changed a lot from 5 years ago. And now, telehealth rates for behavioral health are, converging on 60, 70, maybe they'll asymptote out at 80+%. I mean, some of these large provider groups are doing 70+% virtual, who used to be 100% in person or largely 100% in person. So, I mean, I think the world has truly changed in terms of where we're expecting mental health to be delivered and our openness to digital mental health broadly as an industry, as society. This has also coincided with a dramatic rise in behavioral health spend, particularly when you look at it through the payer lens. And so, I think all of that is really exciting and provides a lot of hope and opportunity to really innovate and make change here. And at the same time, I think some of our initial hypotheses about what was going to work and what wasn't have been challenged, frankly. I think there's a question in the chat around paratherapeutics and kind of how that affects the current funding environment. And I would say there's like a lot of cold water been thrown on classic digital therapeutics. This idea that if you can, I mean, not to be too harsh about it, but like to digitize a CBT workbook and put it in an app, that then you could get FDA approval and then, something magical would happen and you'd make billions of dollars. Like that hypothesis is not proven to work. In fact, it's been disproven on a few different occasions. And I think that's left us at a really interesting moment right now where, the venture market broadly is, fairly pulled back. And people are not seeing a reason to feel greed about digital therapeutics or that kind of business model today. And so on one hand, that feels very pessimistic. I think that the other side of this, though, is that we've also got large language models and AI coming out right now, and there's a huge amount of optimism there. And that's, and so there's sort of this countervailing pieces here, where on one hand, if we thought that, like, if we looked at a digital therapeutic model and we said, okay, like problem there is engagement to some degree, and then like distribution, reimbursement, these are big problems. On one hand, like if you think engagement is probably one of the most important parts here, if you get people to actually do the thing, they'll get better, kind of engagement, right? Like when you look at these large language models, they're hugely engaging. And so maybe there's something really exciting there, and we're on the precipice of, kind of a renaissance in this space, or at least a huge wave of growth in our space. It still leaves us in a place where regulation, distribution, and reimbursement they're not unanswerable questions per se, or they're not like, it's not like impossible, but we don't have the model today, in my mind, that is really like, that's just the model everyone needs to follow and replicate and just take your widget and push it through that model. I think we're in a place where, the pieces are moving around on the board a bit, and I think we're all trying to figure out what the right next move is.
Great, thanks. Really insightful thoughts. So one question, and I've seen this come up in a lot of research studies I've been on, not necessarily in the industry context, but one question that was posed is, when getting NIH funding in an industry context, how do you balance research timelines and deliverables with business timelines and key results? And, I think, this also applies to not funding in NIH context as well. I'm sure, Andrew, thinking about how you balance research demands and other demands that are present in the digital mental health world. So maybe, Dr. Haim, if you could talk about that first a little bit from the NIH perspective. Yeah,
so it's tricky, right? So when you're, utilizing the incredible power of industry and you fund, a partnership, let's say, between academia and industry, or a small business who, in fact, is involved in industry, there's pivots that occur, and there's the reality that if there's churn at the top and there's no longer interest in research, that can completely destroy a project that's ongoing. So we're so totally aware that happens, but there's also a significant upside in that there's the opportunity for recruitment to happen much more quickly. There's the opportunity to embed in novel innovations that occur during the life cycle that you can add to the product. Obviously, there's challenges when it comes to keeping things fixed for like an efficacy trial, but we certainly are aware that there's a number of additional variables that occur when partnering with industry And we have some ability to adapt to those. We also understand that in some cases, those challenges will result in negative outcomes, but that's sort of the nature of the high risk, high reward reality of partnering with industry.
Andrew, what are your thoughts on how you kind of balance some of these aspects of research timelines, business deliverables, timelines in business, and maybe some of the friction that happens as we think about overlap and intersection of business and research?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's tricky, right? And thinking about how to align these, like I think we've gotten a lot of our frameworks from, let's say, the classic therapeutics pipeline, and I think that back to what I was saying earlier, one of the big challenges is that like we haven't seen that work for us, right? In our space, just to put it bluntly, right? In a classic model where you prove that this compound works, and then it's like either sold or like partnership distribution with a big pharma company who already has a sales force, and whatever, like the whole thing, the whole machine on the back end comes together because you have this really special molecule, right? And that's not true for how most of I don't think the analogy holds very well for the kinds of things that we're doing. And so what that means is I think we're having to figure out to some extent today, and this is both the challenge and the opportunity, is figuring out what are the right models for aligning like the benefits of this research and why it's important with the business outcomes and the business benefits, right? And so what I found, in general, the classic Silicon Valley wisdom is that like startups have basically one major advantage, which is sort of speed or agility, right? A combination of the two. Right. And then, when you think about what makes like a great founder, probably one of the top qualities that you'd think of would be resourcefulness. And so when we're thinking about how you align these, usually it means doing more with less, being scrappier, moving faster, and trying to like essentially do the quickest version of your hypothesis testing that you can to get the outcome you need for the business to go to the next level and to run the next set of experiments and so on and so forth, right? I think that where we see friction is in my mind, and obviously I have a very biased perspective on this, and there'd probably be plenty of people who would push back or disagree, but we see challenges when we sort of the research side is overscoped, takes too long, and frankly just doesn't align with the speed or timeline of a startup. And often that doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. It just means that it's like misaligned with doing it in a startup context. And so that's what we're trying to weed out or kind of figure out in many cases is how do we make sure that whatever needs to be done on the research side is very aligned with not only like the startup's goals, and it's not something that sits off to the side, but also is something that like works with the startup's timeline that like realistically can be done by the time you need the next funding round or to get that big customer or whatever the ultimate goal is.
Yeah, I think those are some really great points, and maybe love to hear you sort of double click and go a little bit deeper on that, Andrew. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about how you might sort of successfully pitch or demonstrate the business value of research. So what do you see has been successful there and what maybe has been unsuccessful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is just my opinion, but I think that on the, for instance, the wellness side, let's say, or the more kind of low acuity side, let's say more consumer driven side, candidly, I have not seen a lot of benefit to that. I think it's interesting for our field. I think it's valuable for knowledge creation writ large and for us to understand what's going on better and build on each other's shoulders. But I haven't seen it drive business outcomes as much, right? I think that you have to get to, maybe, but then when you start to say selling B2B, it starts to matter a little more. So if I say selling to like an employer as a benefit, I think the research starts to matter a bit more and it unlocks and kind of greases the skids in some of the process, right? And that's valuable. And then when you're going to selling, if you're selling like something that is a clinical service to a payer, right? Then you all of a sudden have like real scrutiny. And I think in a lot of ways, it's a great incentive, right? For companies to have to really demonstrate, okay, this is going to work, right? And maybe it's, and demonstrate maybe even cost effectiveness as Dr. Haim was alluding to earlier, right? And I think these kinds of questions, when they come in, are usually most powerful when they're aligned with a kind of reimbursement, business model, or distribution question, right? And I think that to the extent they're not, the research is sort of let's call it a nice to have. I think it risks being a distraction. And in startups, back to that point of speed and agility and just being as like running as fast as you can in the direction you need to, I think that for the most part, I've seen it be most successful when you're talking about companies are selling to payers, and then maybe to some slightly lesser degree, companies are selling to employers. And really the goal should be that business model unlock. There's also a whole different like regulatory side of it, which is like not, maybe I think outside of the scope of what we're talking about here, but for the most part, just these things aren't like therapy, a lot of these digital mental health interventions don't seem to fit nicely within our existing regulatory framework. And so, it's less of a gating item for them as far as I've seen.
Yeah, those are really, really great points. Dr. Haim, what are your thoughts on the business value of research? I mean, I think especially as one thinks about SBIRs and STTR grants, where you have to write a business plan and a research plan as part of those funding mechanisms.
Right. So it's a great question. And I'll start by just going on a little bit of a tangent. I think, what's changed in the last 5 years as well is that like we underestimated that our consumers want to know whether what they're buying or may be interested in buying works. And I think that research, it's super important. Does this product, going beyond wellness, looking at, treating mental illness, is it going to work? Is it sustainable? And I think that there's that value piece there. Small businesses often struggle when they come in around, all right, how do we make the research compelling in such a way that it is, beneficial for us in terms of marketing? And it's tricky, right? So you have the cost piece, but you also have the, how am I going to implement it? How am I going to do this research in such a way that it accomplishes the what the funder is looking for, but it also helps me as well? And we've developed in-house, the NIH has a number of programs. We have a commercialization assistance program. We have there's a whole unit, the SEED unit at NIH, which helps applicants and grantees to really crisp up those questions. And there's a consultation service where you meet with experts, say, okay, here's how you might structure this research in such a way that it accomplishes those aims. But I will agree, it's tricky. But from my vantage, it's a little easy because it's a requirement. If you want funding from us, you need to come up with really compelling research questions. But again, we think beyond the answer to the research question, we also want to, how does this help disseminate and implement these interventions, which we hope work.
Great, thanks. We're going to go to a couple of the audience questions. So we have a question in here. To what extent have companies been pivoting to non-clinical wellness use cases to increase speed to market? So I'd be curious your thoughts about that, especially as we were just talking a little bit about, differences in sort of evidence expectations between wellness and clinical products.
You want me to start? I'm happy to jump in. Okay. I mean, I think that there are many companies that actually just start with wellness use cases, to be clear. Like, it's not a pivot into wellness use cases necessarily. I think there are other companies that have undergone that. I think it's a little bit, it's hard for me to paint with a super broad brush here. It's very case by case. I think there's some situations where, it makes sense to do that and to use that time. If you have something that has a powerful consumer value proposition, people want to use it, and, and you're in a place where, you can actually fund your business or at least, help offset the cost of running the business and generate evidence, and then use that to be patient to go after a more kind of clinical use case or clinical approach. I'm certainly for that, presuming all the other pieces check out. I think that the challenge that we see sometimes is people saying, oh, going after this clinical side is super hard. Let's do consumer or wellness because it's easy. And I think they're generally wrong about that. Like, I think that's the pitfall in this. If I was to paint with a broad brush, and again, like, want to acknowledge that there's it's very, very case by case, and there's no right answer. And if there was, this would be a lot easier than it is. But I think the pitfall here is thinking, well, it's so hard to go and get, payers on board or whatnot. And so therefore, I'm just going to stand up a website and try to get people to come in the front door. I think what people will find is that the things that you're, this is obviously, again, painting with a broad brush, but the things that you're optimizing for in getting consumers in the front door to pay for something, or even employers to pay for a wellness benefit, are really different motions and different products than the ones that are more clinical. And they're not 100% different, but they're different enough that I think it risks being a distraction, and you can be kind of mediocre or bad at both. rather than being great at any one of them. And so I guess my general encouragement in these kinds of situations would just be to, like, if that's the hill you need to climb, then go climb that hill, even if it's hard. This isn't like supposed to be easy in a certain case. And I think there are often these shortcuts can be kind of traps.
Dr. Haim, what do you think about that? I mean, I imagine the wellness space is interesting and challenging at NIMH, especially as you mentioned the fact that you focus on, diagnosing and treating mental illness.
So from the prevention perspective, certainly there's a space for wellness if you're building resiliency, and it might impact the potential onset, positively impact the potential onset of a future mental illness. I think that there's definitely a space for that. I think we can all acknowledge that for interventions that are focused on clinical outcomes, focusing on treating mental illness, the regulatory process is somewhat new, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, it's somewhat clunky. But that, in my opinion, should not be the reason to create a product that in essence is a clinical product that you're turning into a wellness product to avoid the regulatory process. Because I don't think that makes sense. I have folks come to me that said I could do one or the other. It's like, well, you should choose. You should base that decision on what your goals are and what you think the product can do, not to avoid having to go down a certain pathway. And I think that trips a lot of people up, where they feel forced into one area or the other, and base that decision not necessarily on good factors.
Really good points. We had a question about if you guys could talk a little bit about the tension that might be present in the digital mental health space, about how much you need to evaluate whether the proposed program will have an impact before you can actually do the development, versus having to do some of the development to make a program that can have an impact. And so trying to think a little bit about how you fund that sort of early development work that might be necessary to get a product to a point where it can actually move the needle on these clinical outcomes that we're thinking about. I think that's a tension in the NIH world. I imagine that's a tension in other funding areas as well. So not sure which of one of you want to tackle that first, but how do we sort of think about that tension?
I can jump in. So, I think that it's always great when people come to us with some pilot data and say, we created this, MVP, and here's a little bit of what we have, and then, okay, well, here's the route, the funding route that you can come in with. But we also, if people come in with good ideas and say, I don't have the data yet, but I really want to develop this to get that early signal, we have funding mechanisms that do that. We have R21 funding mechanisms. The phase 1 SBIR is really designed to, okay, you have an idea, the research shows that this idea might be a good idea, and we're going to give you some seed money to further develop that idea. I think a misnomer is people think they need to come in for funding with us with a fully shaped idea with really strong pilot data, and then get funding for that, like efficacy and effectiveness. We start funding things much earlier on, and I really want to get that message out there.
And I think from our perspective, mine is actually potentially surprisingly similar, which is that we generally, for the most part, are funding things that have some amount of proof around them. But we will start with very early stage ideas that are kind of, call it napkin sketches in some cases. I think that when I think about the role of venture capital in particular, and maybe trying to speak not just for us and our investment theses, but also the broader space, I think that venture capital for founders generally should be your funding of last resort. Maybe not last resort, but it's expensive capital. And it's used for, in my mind, best used for essentially proving out what's needed to be able to actually stepwise scale something up. And so often, if there's a way to get research grant funding, or there's a way, some kind of other non-dilutive funding source to actually prove the initial bones of the concept, or if you can kind of bootstrap that initial phase to generate some piece of evidence or proof points, it doesn't have to be, from our perspective, doesn't have to be publishable in a peer-reviewed kind of journal, but it is important to think about, back to this point of resourcefulness, from our perspective, why are you taking the approach that you're taking, right? And what could you prove before getting here? And then if you're against that wall and you're saying, okay, like there's this amazing step function that can happen, and here's why I need this amount of capital to go do it, like that's totally fine. I think that we don't have any dogma around that, and I don't think the venture world does in general. What I would say is the venture world is perhaps less altruistic than our colleagues at the NIMH, insofar as they're going to be looking for something that's going to make them feel greedy, essentially, for lack of a better word. They're going to look for something that, okay, I'm getting a good deal here, and like if this works, it's going to be really big. And that's, I think the way that the venture capital industry thinks as a whole. And in many ways, they're not as worried about like why it might not work, although they'll spend time on that and try to de-risk that. But they're more worried about, okay, like let's say we give you this $500,000 of first capital into the company. Like, let's say your experiment works. Okay, then what? Right? Like, does this actually really go somewhere? And I think that, so from that perspective, maybe our lenses are different in many ways, but I think there's always some amount of flexibility, and there's also in the venture capital world, particularly, there really aren't any rules hard and fast about what gets funded or what doesn't. And it's, I think from the entrepreneur perspective, having been on that side of the table, is often kind of like maddeningly subjective. But unfortunately, luckily there are lots of venture capitalists. So hopefully, you can fit into somebody's subjective box.
Awesome. I learned I should send a box of my napkin sketches to Andrew and send all my early stage ideas to Dr. Haim as R21. So I learned a lot in that question. We have a question from the audience. Can you comment on how clinical outcomes in healthcare may differ from outcomes in education, where companies should be focused on where companies focused on student mental health should consider research funding? And I think I've really seen a sea change in the sort of school-based technology. I think some of these ed tech technologies have moved to social emotional learning, moved to mental health writ large, I think, especially with the pandemic. So really curious your guys' thoughts on thinking about educational-based funding, school-based funding. What are you guys seeing kind of the school and education space?
Andrew, you want to go ahead?
No, go right ahead.
So, youth mental health is a huge focus at the NIMH. And we fund a lot of school-based interventions that incorporate digital health, digital mental health. Now, agreed, the outcomes may be slightly different, but there's also a lot of common outcomes when you're trying to prevent mental illness. You're trying to increase social emotional learning. So, it is certainly a space that we're interested in. It's a space also that IES is interested, obviously, as well. But it's incorporated into the fabric of what we do, and it's a different setting. But it's not something that we put in a completely different bucket. So it's an area of interest for us.
Yeah, and I'll answer the question from a slightly different lens. And I certainly would not be the expert on where companies should be focused considering research funding. But one thing that maybe is a helpful insight from kind of further downstream is that what we're seeing across that youth mental health space, and particularly in school-based models, we're seeing a desire to essentially pull in more and more healthcare dollars and payer dollars to help cover these interventions. And so I think that, like, if somebody, if you're thinking about from the very highest level, how do we impact this population of students in their mental health, emotional well-being, et cetera, thinking about those more, call it like clinical or healthcare oriented outcomes, or how it might fit into the broader healthcare system, I think is an important lens to take, or could potentially lead to unlocks, as the number of dollars that are available within school systems are just always under a lot of pressure, and as our healthcare dollars are not necessarily super easy to come by. But I think that we're seeing a lot of companies working towards finding ways to split that, right? And so finding a way for the education system and like maybe schools to cover some piece of something, and for the healthcare system to cover its piece. And when you're thinking about a specific intervention, designing for both of those in mind, I think would be wise.
Yeah, and I know here in California, there's been an increased push to allow different school-based programs to be billed to Medi-Cal, and even programs that are just in proximity to school campuses to be Medi-Cal billed. So I think a lot of the healthcare ecosystem is going to, perhaps shift some of the way these dollars are being spent.
That's a great point. Maybe one other thing to add on that is to really like the PSA for understanding what's going on in your state specifically, or whatever state you're trying to serve. There's a lot of different things at different, like at the state level around youth mental health in many different states that differ, and lots of reimbursement mechanisms or funding sources, and it's not easy to find it, but I think it's often worth the work to do so.
Yeah, speaking of that, Dr. Haim, I'd be curious your thoughts around, are there funding mechanisms or ways that you would sort of suggest people who are interested in some of those policy or sort of local questions thinking about being able to fund that type of research at NIMH?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, so the division that I sit under, which is one of the three primary funding divisions, focuses on treatment and prevention, as well as services and implementation questions. And we have standing funding announcements and initiatives that really focus on embedding interventions into different service settings, how to make them stick, how to make them engaging, looking at different reimbursement strategies in those areas. So we have a whole host of funding announcements. If I have fast enough fingers, I can start plopping them into the chat. But yeah, it's definitely an area of focus for us. Not only do the intervention, can we test to see whether they work, but what policies need to be in place, and what existing policies can we leverage in a meaningful way to get implementation and dissemination done at scale.
Great. We have sort of an inside baseball question for you, Dr. Haim, about NIMH funding specifically. But the question is, there's been some discussion about the idea that supplements to R01s or other parent grants are being greatly cut back. Can you comment on how accurate that is, or any sort of changes you've seen specifically to those types of supplements?
Wow, I feel like there's an audience member who has a very, very specific question, and maybe they sought supplemental funding and it didn't happen the way that they wanted it to. So NIH has a number of different ways. If you have an active NIH grant, there are a number of different ways to supplement that grant. So we have diversity supplements to try to train new faculty. We have supplements if you have an idea that you want to tack on, a new idea that you want to tack on to your existing grant, there's a competitive revision, a competitive supplement where you put the idea and it gets reviewed, and then if it's meritorious, it gets funded. There's the other bucket, which is administrative supplements, where if you are having trouble recruiting, or there's an unexpected expense that you didn't account for, you can come in for an administrative supplement, which does not need to go to the review process. The external review process gets reviewed in-house. I would say within COVID, there was a large number of unexpected expenses that occurred, and people were coming in for administrative supplements, and there were specific calls for COVID supplements. That funding stream has dried up, and the notion of what is an administrative supplement, so additional funds for completing the research that you propose that's within scope, we are looking very closely at what comes in to make sure that it's within scope, but nothing has fundamentally changed in terms of our regulations or processes.
So great, thanks. Well, we're almost at the end of our time, almost at the top of the hour. So I want to kind of just close up, and question for each of you. What do you see as some changes that might be coming down the pike? What do you sort of anticipate for the future of funding for digital mental health research?
I mean, maybe I'll start off here, and I think that I'll take the broader lens of funding for digital mental health in general, but research as part of that. I think we're going to see we're in a period of pullback from a venture lens, and so speaking to that world, I think the bar has just gone up. Frankly, people are looking for more proof points. And so I think from that perspective, it advantages founders who are bringing some amount of evidence to the table, right, that this thing works before going for that first round of funding. I think we're going to stay in this period for, it'd be unwise to make broad sweeping macroeconomic predictions, but I don't think it's changing in the next couple of quarters, right? And so we'll see where things evolve from here. But I really think that one of the benefits of our space being relatively nascent and evolving and moving quickly is that we can learn fast together. And I'm hopeful that we will, collectively absorb the lessons of the last couple of years and continue to learn together here, and hopefully get much more efficient about like what we're funding, how we're funding it, how we're regulating it, all of that, because I think that it's so needed in this moment, given the scale of the problem. And I think working in the space, it's easy to kind of like almost forget about that part, right? The scale and the need, but also the dollars that are chasing this. And so I don't see, in a broad sense, I see this being a continued prioritized area of investment and a very important and potentially valuable place to build businesses. And so I have optimism because of the strong secular trends behind what we're all focused on here. And at the same time, given this current environment around venture capital in particular, I think it's going to require just a high degree of scrappiness from founders and, proving more with less.
Dr. Haim, what do you see for the future?
Yeah, I'll try to be short here. So, at one point, I would say funders were funding digital health interventions because they were digital health interventions, right? And there were very interesting, novel ways of utilizing technology to put out interventions. I think at this point we're more nuanced. I think we really want specific use cases, and I also think that there is an impending glut of stuff that's stuck in the efficacy space and early effectiveness space. And I think there's going to be a real push to try to get that stuff out there into the world in a way that it's sustainable, and maybe less of a focus on just funding digital health because digital health is cool. I think that we're going to become much more nuanced in what we're looking for, because digital health has pervaded everything, and it's not a separate thing at this point.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, your expertise. This was a fantastic panel. I volunteered to moderate it because I wanted to be able to ask you the questions I really wanted the answers to, and I got that opportunity. So I really appreciate being able to just gain your wisdom. So thank you so much. This was a great panel, and I hope everyone else enjoys the rest of the conference. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. I learned a lot too.